Hi, welcome to another episode of Parents of Patriots with me, your host, Lisa Logan. This will be the 5th video in our series on Sinister SEL. If you've been following along, you probably know by now that the transformative social emotional learning pushed by CASEL through programs like Second Step wants to bring our children into a critical consciousness. Then they'll believe the system is broken and that they need to become agents of change or activists to disrupt the system to make it more equitable, which to the Marxists means equal outcomes, and valuing collectivism over individualism. I get asked a lot by people whether they think SEL is something that started out as something good and then got co-opted by bad people, or if it was sinister from its inception. I hope today's video clears that up for you. We'll talk about it on the other side of the presentation. In the beginning video of the series, I talked about how social emotional learning isn't new, but rooted in early progressive American education, with educators like John Dewey and Edward Thorndike advocating that we link education with psychology. These men saw education's potential of social behaviorism, which is manipulating the psychological aspects of learning as a means of manipulating the child. Again, I'll mention that Dewey was inspired by the Soviet educational system. In the Humanist Manifesto, which he signed and co-authored, he prescribed collectivism, which is a political theory associated with communism as a cure for society's ills. Remember, collectivism is the idea that people should prioritize the good of society over the welfare of the individual, and that decisions should benefit all the people to produce equal outcomes. It is the opposite of what America was founded on, which is individualism, where equal opportunity is the main focus, and outcomes will vary based on what individuals do with that opportunity. Dewey thought the main focus of education during the early years should be socialization and emphasizing collectivism. In his important 1898 essay, The Primary Education Fetish, Dewey argued strongly against the then heavy emphasis on reading, writing, and arithmetic. In particular, he wanted to concentrate on giving children, quote, the habits of thought and action, end quote, that he believed were, quote, required for effective participation in community life, end quote. Producing highly literate, independent-minded individualists is not conducive to a collectivist utopia, obviously. So this focus on using education to develop social-emotional skills has been going on for quite some time, but we really saw things accelerate in the 1990s and 2000s. SEL proponents saw huge potential in improved school and community climate through what they called conflict resolution education, or CRE. And there was a huge international conference, the third one of its kind, held in 2010 on the subject entitled, quote, Building Infrastructure for Change, Innovations in Conflict Resolution Education, or CRE, and Justice Initiatives. The conference was held in Cleveland, Ohio for professionals like educators, police officers, mediators, and social workers to further their education and brush up on their skills. It brought together government representatives from among the 50 states around the globe and their non-governmental organization partners who had legislation or policies in place to deliver CRE, SEL, and peace and civics education at the K-12 level and in universities. In attendance was a journalist named Mary Graeber. She had escaped communist Yugoslavia as a 2-year-old with her parents, and she would eventually go on to author the book Debunking Howard Zinn, exposing the fake history that turned a generation against America. Her plan was to participate in the sessions of conferences like these and write reports about them in an attempt to expose the corruption seeping into education. She, quote, was seeing part of a movement at community colleges and other schools to transform students into pacifist citizens of the world. The larger goal of SEL is to train the students in peace-building skills that he can carry over into adulthood as a global citizen and perhaps a global leader. In the attempt to achieve this goal, American and Western values of justice, fairness, and lawfulness are shunned in favor of international law, cooperation, and global social justice. She continues, the fact that the conference is international in scope and has as a kickoff keynote speaker Kevin Jennings indicates a much larger agenda at play. In 1999, Jennings wrote the foreword to a book titled Queering Elementary Education. Jennings, Assistant Deputy Secretary, Office of Safe and Drug-Free Schools under Obama's Ed Secretary Ani Duncan, quote, entered public service as founder and leader of GLSEN, the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network, a group that promoted homosexuality in the school. Advocates of SEL, who have their own left-wing agendas or professional ambitions, promote social acceptance through disturbing group lessons." End quote. Graeber goes on to describe these lessons in detail in her report, which I'll link in the video description. She says that, quote, "the methods are scary and involve such group activities as truth sessions and trust exercises. Such exercises invade students' privacy and further subject them to emotional manipulations. Citizens, parents, and elected officials should be concerned." She goes on, "The goal is nothing less than a re-education of children, but at the most fundamental level, emotionally. The psychologically invasive strategies used in the classroom by a slew of re-educated teachers and emotional intelligence entrepreneurs are frightening. Such re-educators are not shy or reserved in their roles that extend far beyond educating in the traditional sense of imparting knowledge and teaching skills. They believe that students need to be reprogrammed in order to bring about a new international order that will ultimately subject the U.S. to a cooperative international order. Their utopian vision includes having future leaders employing the skills they have learned under the peace educators' tutelage and solving international conflicts through mediation. On both an individual level in terms of each child and on an international level, their vision portends disaster, emotional scarring for the child, and vulnerability to the many leaders who will take advantage of pacifist American leaders. To achieve this goal Mary Graeber said they have of creating a global citizenship, you need global education and really global curriculum and assessments in order to push systemic social-emotional learning. This lines up with the mission of UNESCO, who we talked about in Sinister SEL Part 2, which is globalized citizenship education, where basically all learners are educated to have a particular worldview. That's why UNESCO has put themselves in charge of Sustainable Development Goal 4. Quality and inclusive education for all. You can see the targets here, but the one I want you to notice is Target 4.7, Education for Sustainable Development and Global Citizenship. For those of you who aren't familiar with SDGs, they are the objectives UN member states agree upon that will guide their efforts and direct their funding for the next 15 years. The current SDGs were renegotiated in 2015, and the UN and its partners are working to accomplish them by 2030. Many of the SDGs are noble goals: zero hunger, no poverty, quality education, clean water, etc. But it also could be argued that some are being pursued through the globalization and domination of all systems of civilization in the name of global equity. In 2015, UNESCO held a big meeting, the World Education Forum, where they came up with the Incheon Declaration. It constitutes the commitment of the education community, 184 member states, by establishing a framework toward achieving the SDGs. The declaration stated that they want to promote certain, quote, values and attitudes required by citizens, and to address human rights, gender equality, health, comprehensive sexuality education, climate change, sustainable livelihoods, and responsible and engaged citizenship, end quote. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, who is a member of the UN Global Compact, was tasked with measuring the success towards advancing and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Its report, Measuring Distance to the SDG Targets, was developed in order to assist member countries, of which the US is a part, with their national implementation of their 2030 agenda. It's important to note that OECD not only collaborates with UNESCO, but also the International Planned Parenthood Federation, which is the largest promoter of children's sexual rights in the world, and the Open Society Foundation, led by billionaire political activist George Soros. It has also received funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. OECD's The Future of Education and Skills 2030 document says, quote, children entering school will need to value common prosperity, sustainability, and well-being above other concerns, and that, quote, curricula should continue to evolve perhaps in radical ways that reflect evolving societal requirements, end quote. What do they mean by radical? Don't worry, I'm about to tell you. Since 2015, OECD has administered the Program for International Student Assessment, or PISA test, to measure cognitive skills. It's an international assessment that measures 15-year-old students' reading, mathematics, and science literacy every 3 years. Nation scores are ranked, providing participating countries and education systems with a global view of their students' performance compared to their peers in other countries. In 2017, it launched its Study on Social Emotional Skills, or SSES, which goes beyond measuring academic skills and branches out into methods of measuring and shaping students' personalities. That doesn't sound scary. As of right now, there are 9 other countries and 1 U.S. city that is participating, which is Houston, Texas, but I'm sure it won't just stay there. The SSES will analyze 2 cohorts of students at ages 10 and 15 to determine what social emotional skills they have and should have, and to develop international instruments to measure such skills. This extraordinarily intrusive study surveys students, parents, teachers, and education administrators to gather data on children's social emotional skills, family background, child's performance, home learning environment, parent-child relationship, parental style, learning activities, and parents' own attitudes and opinions. They say, the SSES will help address numerous questions that are important for policymakers, teachers, school administrators, and parents. These are the types of questions they'll ask. I don't know about you, but I don't want a government entity peering into the psyche of my child or my family life and dissecting them. These assessments represent an expansion of student surveillance beyond the school and into the home and family life. Noteworthy also is the admission that the sensitive data gathered from this surveillance will be used to impose government-favored SEL standards and skills on families. What government-favored positions does the OECD promote? In their Future of Education and Skills Education 2030 document, the entity says global education, or UN efforts, are designed to focus on environmentalism, focusing on climate change and the depletion of natural resources, which require urgent action and adaptation, economic change requiring new economic, social, and institutional models, and social evolution arising from, quote, cultural diversity. Kimberly Ells points out in her article from the Epoch Times that, quote, encapsulated in these 3 points are the seeds of the global takeover of energy resources, a transition from capitalism to more equitable economic models, i.e. socialism, and the intentional rise of diverse family structures and a sexually diverse culture, end quote. The SSES survey measures students' performance in the 5 broad domains known to psychologists as the Big 5 model of, quote, emotional regulation, engaging with others, collaboration or agreeableness, task performance, and open-mindedness, end quote. These were the same personality traits assessed by Facebook and Cambridge Analytica in their controversial partnership that data mined Facebook users during both the 2012 and 2016 presidential campaigns to determine the psychological makeup of voters. Using that data, the company assigned a score to each voter. It then tailored ads accordingly and targeted those voters with them. It makes you wonder what they're using this psychological data for in this instance to target our kids with. Turns out it's interventions to improve their personalities if they have disappointing results on the SSES. The skills that were chosen for inclusion in the survey have a requirement that they are malleable and susceptible to possible policy interventions. Extensive research shows that children are not born with a fixed set of skills and little room for improvement, but instead have considerable potential to develop social and emotional skills which are influenced by their experiences and their environment throughout life. This is especially the case during adolescence. Here is an excerpt from an article aptly titled, Why Education is Embracing Facebook-Style Personality Profiling for School Children. It states, the organization is seeking to measure student personality to gather policy-relevant insights for participating countries. The inevitable consequence in countries with disappointing results will be new policies and interventions to improve students' personalities to ensure competitiveness in the global race. Just as PISA has influenced a global market and products to support the skills tested by the assessment, the same is now occurring around social-emotional learning and personality development. Why do they have to do interventions to improve students' personalities? Well, according to OECD's document, Global Competency for an Inclusive World, it's to, quote, counter the discriminatory behaviors picked up at school and in the family in order to teach young people to challenge cultural and gender stereotypes and to help create tolerant, integrated societies. Since SSES will also analyze information from students' interaction with online instruments to surveil, quote, what people do, think, or feel when interacting with and responding to the item or task, it is a legitimate concern that any and all of this data could be used to help them figure out how to create more effective programs that coerce children away from the ideals of their family and into their way of thinking, especially when familial religious or cultural beliefs prevent your child from being, in their eyes, more inclusive. So how does this all fit into the bigger picture of what I'm trying to tell you? I'll bring back this chart, which shows OECD on the bottom left there, and CASEL, who is the organization that sets the standards for all SEL, on the bottom right. Now let me show you this chart, which ties together pretty much everything we've talked about in this series up to this point. You can see that the same organizations and people who transformed our educational system with Common Core to nationalize standards around cognitive learning want to restructure how we measure student success with social and emotional skills through SEL. And if there's still any question as to whether the UN is behind many of the changes we're seeing in education, especially social emotional learning, all you have to do is watch this video from a panel discussion at the CASEL 2019 SEL Exchange. The person on the left is Koji Miyamoto, a senior economist for Education Global Practice at the World Bank. Previously, he was the project leader of Ceres Education and Social Progress, or ESP project, and prior to that, he was the project lead for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development's SSES. The gentleman in the middle is Professor Dr. Anantha Durayappa. He is the director of UNESCO's Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Education for Peace and Sustainable Development. The man on the right is Luca Perry, who sits on the executive committee of Karanga, whose mission is to create a global alliance for social emotional learning and life skills.
So, Anantha, maybe you can give us a little bit about your perspective on the global movement and how to influence the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals.
I just want to see how many people have heard of the SDGs with a show of hands. We still have lots of work to do. Well, these were 17 ambitious goals which were adopted by 193 countries in 2015. And they're ambitious, something that's required. What's very different of the SDGs is that it's relevant for every country. It's not a development agenda anymore just for developing countries, but it's relevant for every country. And I thought that was a major shift in the right direction. I want to go now to SDG 4. And if you look at SDG 4, this is on education. You got quality education. 3 words that I want you to focus on is quality, inclusive, and equity. But what we actually at the Institute have been struggling with is, have we really put, in a sense of getting the momentum, this global momentum, have we really put the cart in front of the horse? Because we really haven't asked the question, what type of education? What is education that we are striving for? And so we need to understand what the goal is, rather than moving away from what we have focused on human capital development for the last 40, 50 years, to one we think of more of a human flourishing. And this is where social-emotional learning really lends itself well, because that's the tool that we have to, bringing the cognitive and the social and emotional together, because they work in tandem. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Luca?
I think for a long time we've been schooling kids, for a particular outcome, which is so that they can participate in the economic paradigm. But now is one of the moments for this movement, I think, globally. In all of the conversations that I've been lucky to participate in, we're even seeing the business community come on board. 9 out of 10 companies are saying we need employees with soft skills. The other 1 in 10 probably won't be companies for much longer. Because really, we know that this is how we deal with AI, with a changing future of work, with the innovation capacity that we need, and some of the paradoxes we see around the world in every single community and society.
A couple of things I want to point out. First off, the moderator at this CASEL conference asks Professor Durayappa to give his perspective on the global movement of SEL and how to influence the SDGs, or Sustainable Development Goals. There you have it. The purpose for SEL is clear as day. Duraiappah also goes on to say how the SDGs are no longer for just developing countries, but for every country. He emphasized 3 words in SDG 4: quality, inclusive, and equity. Knowing what you know now about the UN's stated goals and how they define those words, it's alarming to know they want to implement their agenda on a global scale. They will get to decide what those terms mean, how they will alter education in pursuit of those meanings, and how they will measure them. Lastly, I want to draw your attention to the statement made by Luca Perry. Companies will either hire based on emotional intelligence and soft skills or won't exist as a company. This should tell you everything about how social-emotional learning competencies will feed into environmental, social, and corporate governance, or ESG scores, which will evolve to assess how inclusive a company's workforce is. Social credit system, anyone? Stay tuned for my next video where we'll be talking about just that. What kind of assessments your school might be using to collect social-emotional learning data, how that data is being used, and where all of this is going. If you want to know when that video comes out, click the bell icon and you'll be notified when I post new content. Don't forget to also like this video and subscribe to my channel. I'll see you soon.